Upon being treated by a nurse in the hospital, the millionaire froze when the nurse showed the bracelet he had given to his sister. The same bracelet she had received before disappearing 30 years ago. The rain hammered against the windshield like bullets as Richard Calloway's BMW skidded across the slick pavement of Interstate 35. He'd been driving for 3 hours straight from Austin, his mind churning over the quarterly reports that spelled disaster in black and red ink. At 48, Richard had built an empire from nothing: oil, real estate, tech investments. But tonight, none of it mattered. The numbers blurred together like everything else in his life. Cold, distant, meaningless. He reached for his coffee cup without taking his eyes off the road. Empty. Of course it was empty. Everything in his life was empty these days. The mansion in Highland Park sat like a mausoleum, filled with expensive furniture and memories he couldn't bear to face. 30 years. 30 goddamn years since Caroline. The deer came out of nowhere. Richard yanked the wheel hard to the right, his heart slamming against his ribs as the BMW spun like a carnival ride gone wrong. Time stretched and contracted, the world becoming a kaleidoscope of headlights, rain, and his own voice screaming Caroline's name. The last thing he remembered was the passenger door crumpling against an oak tree older than his guilt. Sir, can you hear me?" The voice floated through a fog of pain and antiseptic. Richard's eyelids felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, but he forced them open. Fluorescent light stabbed at his brain, and he winced. Turning his head slightly, a young woman in navy scrubs leaned over him, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, brown eyes focused and concerned. "There we go," she said, her voice gentle but professional. "I'm Isabella, your nurse. You're in the emergency room at St. Raphael Hospital in Dallas. You've been in a car accident, but you're going to be okay." Richard tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Isabella seemed to read his mind, reaching for a cup of ice chips on the bedside table. As she moved, something caught the light on her wrist, a flash of silver and deep red that made Richard's world tilt sideways. "Just a few ice chips for now," Isabella was saying, but her words sounded like they were coming from underwater. Richard's eyes were locked on her wrist, on the delicate silver bracelet that caught the harsh hospital lighting. The ruby in the center pulsed like a heartbeat, like a wound that never healed. No, it couldn't be. Not after all these years. "Sir, you look pale. Are you feeling nauseous?" Isabella's voice sharpened with concern, but Richard barely heard her. The bracelet. That bracelet. He'd given it to Caroline for her 10th birthday, just 3 days before. Richie. "It's so pretty. Is that a real ruby?" "Course it's real, Squirt. Only the best for my favorite little sister." Caroline had thrown her skinny arms around his neck, the bracelet catching the morning light streaming through the kitchen window. "I'll never take it off. I promise. Never, ever." And she hadn't. Not until they took her. "Sir." Isabella's hand was on his shoulder now, warm and steady. "Should I call Dr. Martinez?" Richard forced himself to focus on her face. Really look at her. She couldn't be more than 25, with olive skin and those serious brown eyes that seemed older than her years. There was something familiar about the way she tilted her head when she was concerned, something that made his chest tight with a hope he'd buried decades ago. "The bracelet," he managed to croak out. Isabella glanced down at her wrist, seeming surprised. "Oh, this old thing. I've had it forever, since I was little." She smiled, but it was a distant smile, the kind people get when they're touching something they don't quite understand. "The nuns at the orphanage said it was with me when I arrived. It's probably not worth much, but," she shrugged, "I guess we all have our security blankets, right?" The orphanage. Richard's mind was racing now, fragments of possibilities crashing together like storm waves. The timeline could work. Caroline had been 10 when she was taken, which would make her 40 now. This girl, Isabella, looked young enough to be, "How old are you?" The question came out more abruptly than he'd intended. Isabella raised an eyebrow, but answered readily enough. 25. Why? 25? The math was brutal and perfect. If Caroline had been 15 if she'd had a baby at 15. "Where did you say you were from?" Richard's heart was hammering so hard he was surprised the heart monitor wasn't screaming. "I didn't," Isabella said, her professional smile wavering slightly. "But I grew up in San Antonio, St. Lucy's Home for Children. She was studying his face now, those dark eyes searching. "Sir, are you sure you're feeling all right? Your vitals are spiking." St. Lucy's. Richard knew that name, had written them checks over the years. Anonymous donations that never seemed like enough. Caroline had loved visiting orphanages when she was little, had always begged their mother to take home all the sad children. The irony was so sharp it cut. "I'm fine," he lied, settling back against the pillow. "Just the pain medication, I think. Makes me ask weird questions." Isabella didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded and reached for the oximeter on his finger. As she leaned in to check the reading, Richard caught a whiff of her perfume, something light and clean, like the jasmine Caroline used to pick from their mother's garden. The ruby on her wrist caught the light again, and Richard had to close his eyes. 30 years of searching, of hiring private investigators and chasing down every lead. No matter how thin, 30 years of wondering if Caroline was alive, if she was happy, if she ever thought about the brother who'd failed to protect her. And now this girl, this young woman, who couldn't possibly be but might be, was standing 3 feet away, wearing Caroline's bracelet like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Your vitals look good," Isabella said, stepping back. "Dr. Martinez will be in soon to talk about your discharge. You were lucky. Just some bruising and a mild concussion. Someone was looking out for you tonight." Richard almost laughed. If someone had been looking out for him, it had taken them 30 years to show up. "Isabella," he said, as she turned to go. She looked back, eyebrows raised. "That's a beautiful name. Spanish. Italian, actually." She smiled, and for just a moment, Richard could swear he saw Caroline in the curve of her lips. "It means, pledged to God." The nuns thought it was fitting, considering where I ended up. After she left, Richard stared at the ceiling tiles and tried to make sense of what he'd just experienced. It could be coincidence. There were probably thousands of ruby bracelets in the world, thousands of girls named Isabella who'd grown up in orphanages. The chances of this being connected to Caroline were astronomical, but the bracelet was identical. Not similar. Identical. Right down to the tiny chip in the silver band where Caroline had caught it on a fence post the week before she disappeared. Richard reached for his phone with shaking hands. He had calls to make, people to hire, because if there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that he'd just met Caroline's daughter, then 30 years of guilt and searching were about to come to an end. One way or another, he was going to find out who Isabella Moore really was. Richard's penthouse office overlooked downtown Dallas like a watchtower, 40 floors above the chaos of morning traffic. But today, the view might as well have been a brick wall. He'd been staring at his phone for 20 minutes. Madison Price's contact information glowing on the screen like a lifeline. He wasn't sure he was brave enough to grab. Madison was the best investigative journalist in Texas, maybe the whole Southwest. She'd taken down 3 corrupt judges, exposed a human trafficking ring, and made politicians sweat just by walking into press conferences. If anyone could dig up the truth about Isabella Moore, it was her. But truth was a double-edged sword. Richard had learned that lesson 30 years ago when the truth about Donald Whitaker's corruption had cost him everything that mattered. His finger hovered over the call button. What if Isabella was just some random girl with a coincidentally similar bracelet? What if he was setting himself up for another 30 years of false hope? What if he hit the button before he could talk himself out of it? Madison Price. It's Richard Calloway. He'd worked with Madison before, funding some of her investigations through anonymous donors. She knew his voice. Well, the mysterious Mr. Calloway emerges from his ivory tower. "What can I do for you?" "I need you to investigate someone." Quietly, very quietly. There was a pause. Madison was probably calculating how much this was going to cost him. How quietly are we talking? The kind of quiet that comes with a 6-figure retainer. "I'm listening." Richard told her everything. The accident. The hospital. Isabella Moore. The bracelet. He described every detail he could remember, down to the tiny chip in the silver band. When he finished, the line was silent for so long he thought the call had dropped. "Richard?" Madison's voice had lost its professional edge. "Do you have any idea how many dead ends we chased looking for Caroline? How many false leads? How many girls who looked like her or had her mannerisms or carried something that belonged to her? This is different. They were all different, until they weren't. Richard closed his eyes. Madison had been covering the Caroline Calloway story for 15 years. Ever since she'd started working the crime beat, she'd seen him at his worst. Drunk, desperate, throwing money at anyone who claimed to have information about his sister. Just look into it, please. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if I'm right, if you're right, then we've got the story of the decade on our hands. Madison's voice had shifted back to business mode. Give me 48 hours, and Richard, try not to do anything stupid while I work. The Stee. Lucy's home for children sat on the outskirts of San Antonio like a forgotten prayer, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Texas sun and storm. Madison had driven down that morning, her press credentials and a healthy donation ensuring cooperation from the staff. Sister Margaret was 87 years old and sharp as a tack, with the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from 50 years of managing orphaned children. She led Madison through corridors lined with artwork and achievement certificates, past a playground where kids were burning off energy during their lunch break. Isabella Moore, Sister Margaret repeated, settling into her office chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones remembered every year. Of course I remember her, sweet child, but so serious, always trying to take care of everyone else. Madison pulled out her notebook. Tell me about when she arrived. Sister Margaret's eyes went distant. It was February 1999, bitter cold, the kind that gets into your bones and stays there. Someone left her on our doorstep in the middle of the night. Just a little thing. Couldn't have been more than 2 years old. Was there anything with her? Any clues about where she came from? A suitcase with some clothes, all too big for her, clean but worn, like someone had packed in a hurry. Sister Margaret paused, her fingers drumming against her desk. And a note. Madison's pen stopped moving. What kind of note? Brief, desperate. It said, "For my little Isa, when she comes home." Nothing else. No signature. No return address. The paper was water-stained, like someone had been crying when they wrote it. And the bracelet. Sister Margaret smiled. Ah, yes, the bracelet. Isabella clutched it so tightly we couldn't get it off her wrist for the first week. She'd scream if anyone tried to take it. Eventually, we just let her keep it. It seemed to comfort her. Madison looked up from her notes. Did you ever try to trace where she came from? Of course we did. We contacted the police, filed all the proper reports. But you have to understand, Miss Price. Children are abandoned here more often than people like to admit. Sometimes families fall apart. Sometimes people make desperate choices without more information. There wasn't much we could do. What about her development? Did she remember anything about her life before? Sister Margaret shook her head. Nothing concrete. She had nightmares sometimes. Would wake up crying for her mama. But most children that young don't retain clear memories of trauma. It's a blessing, really. Madison spent the next hour going through Isabella's file. School records showed a bright, dedicated student who'd earned a full scholarship to the University of Texas nursing program. Teachers described her as quiet but determined, always the first to volunteer when other children needed help. She visited sometimes after she graduated, Sister Margaret added as Madison was packing up her notes. Always brought gifts for the current children. Never forgot where she came from. Last time was about 6 months ago. She'd just started working at some big hospital in Dallas. St. Raphael. That's the one. Said she wanted to save lives because someone had saved hers by bringing her here. Sister Margaret's eyes glistened. That's the kind of young woman Isabella became, Miss Price. Whatever happened to her before she came to us, she didn't let it define her. Madison's phone rang as she was driving back to Dallas, the flat Texas landscape stretching endlessly in all directions. Richard's name flashed on her dashboard display. Tell me you've got something. His voice came through the speakers, tight with barely controlled hope. I've got something, but I'm not sure what it means yet. Madison filled him in on her conversation with Sister Margaret, watching the speedometer creep up as she talked. The timeline works, Richard. If Caroline was taken in 1994 and had a baby in 1997, Isabella would be the right age. The note mentioned Isa. Yeah, but that could be short for any number of names. Isabella, Isabel, Isadora. Caroline always said she wanted to name her daughter Isabella, after our grandmother. Madison felt that familiar tingle that meant she was onto something big. Richard, I need you to be very careful here. If Isabella really is Caroline's daughter, and if Caroline is still alive somewhere, then approaching this wrong could put them both in danger. What do you mean? Think about it. Someone took Caroline and kept her hidden for 30 years. Someone with enough power and reach to make a 10-year-old girl disappear without a trace. If they're still out there, if they're still watching, then finding Isabella could lead them right to Caroline. Richard's voice was grim. Or it could get them both killed. Madison pulled into a gas station, needing to focus completely on this conversation. I'm going to keep digging, but we need to be smart about this. No direct contact with Isabella yet. No questions that might spook her or tip off the wrong people. How long? Give me another 48 hours. I want to run down some other leads first. Hospital records, employment history, maybe find some of her college friends. If this is really Caroline's daughter, then there might be other breadcrumbs we can follow. After she hung up, Madison sat in her car for a long time, watching trucks rumble past on the interstate. 30 years ago, a little girl had vanished from the safest place in her world. Her own backyard now, another young woman was living a quiet life in Dallas, wearing a ruby bracelet and saving lives, completely unaware that she might be the key to solving one of Texas's most heartbreaking mysteries. Madison started the engine and pulled back onto the highway. She had work to do, and somewhere out there, the truth was waiting to be found. Madison's apartment looked like a hurricane had hit a library. Newspaper clippings, photocopied police reports, and printed internet articles covered every surface of her dining room table. She'd been at it for 18 hours straight, fueled by coffee and the kind of obsessive energy that came with knowing she was close to something huge. The name Donald Whitaker had first appeared in a 1993 corruption investigation involving city contracts in Austin. Small-time stuff at first. Inflated invoices. Suspicious no-bid awards. The usual municipal grift that barely made the back pages. But Madison had learned to follow the money, and Whitaker's money led to some very dark places. Her phone buzzed. A text from her source at the FBI. Found something. Check your email. Madison's laptop chimed with an incoming message. The attachment was a scanned document from 1994, marked confidential, in red letters across the top. As she read, her coffee grew cold and her blood ran ice cold. The document was an internal memo detailing an investigation into a bidding conspiracy for several major construction projects in Austin. At the center of it all was Whitaker Construction, owned and operated by Donald Whitaker, a man who'd apparently decided that legitimate business was for suckers. But what made Madison's hands shake was the name listed as the primary witness. Robert Calloway, Richard's father. Jesus Christ, she whispered to her empty apartment. According to the memo, Robert Calloway had uncovered evidence that Whitaker was bribing city officials and inflating contract prices by as much as 40%. When Robert threatened to go public, Whitaker had tried to buy his silence. When that failed, he'd tried intimidation. When that failed, he'd made threats. Specific threats. Against Robert's family. Madison scrolled down to find copies of the actual police reports from Caroline's disappearance. She'd seen them before, but now she was reading them with new eyes. The kidnapping had happened just 3 days after Robert Calloway's testimony was scheduled to be delivered to the grand jury. 3 days. Madison reached for her phone and called Richard. It rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Tell me you've got good news." "I've got news. I'm not sure if it's good." Madison took a deep breath. "Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did your father ever mention Donald Whitaker?" The silence stretched so long, Madison thought the call had dropped. "Richard, where did you hear that name?" His voice had gone flat and dangerous. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. I found FBI documents from 1994. Your father was the star witness in a corruption case against Whitaker. He was supposed to testify 3 days after Caroline was taken. Son of a bitch." Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "Son of a goddamn bitch. You knew. I knew my father was working on some big investigation before Caroline disappeared. He was stressed, paranoid, kept talking about how some people would do anything to protect their secrets, but he never told me the details. Said it was safer if I didn't know." Madison could hear Richard moving around, probably pacing like he always did when he was agitated. What happened after Caroline was taken? Dad fell apart. Completely fell apart. He withdrew his testimony, stopped cooperating with the investigation, said nothing was worth losing another child. Richard's voice cracked. The case collapsed. Whitaker walked away clean. And your father never tried to pursue it. How could he? Whitaker had proven he could reach into our home, into our family, and take whatever he wanted. Dad spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Madison was already pulling up new searches on her laptop, diving deeper into Whitaker's background. Richard, if Whitaker took Caroline to silence your father, then he had to keep her somewhere. Somewhere he could control the situation completely. You think she's still alive? I think if Whitaker killed her, he would have made sure your father knew about it. Dead children don't make effective leverage, but living children you can threaten to hurt at any moment. That's power that lasts forever. Madison's screen filled with property records, business licenses, shell corporations. Whitaker's empire was vast and complex, stretching across 3 states, ranches, warehouses, construction sites, rental properties, dozens of places where someone could hide a kidnapped child. There's something else, Madison said, highlighting a particularly interesting document. After the investigation collapsed, Whitaker's business exploded. He went from small-time municipal contracts to major federal projects. It's like someone rolled out the red carpet for him. Someone who owed him a favor for keeping quiet. Or someone who was part of the corruption from the beginning. Madison cross-referenced names from the original investigation with Whitaker's subsequent business partners. Richard, this wasn't just about city contracts. This was about a whole network of corruption. And your father stumbled into it. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Caroline hadn't been kidnapped by some random criminal. She'd been taken by a man with resources, connections, and the absolute ruthlessness to destroy a family to protect his own interests. Madison. Richard's voice had gone quiet. If Whitaker kept Caroline alive all these years, if Isabella really is her daughter, then he's still out there. Still watching, still protecting his secrets. Madison's laptop chimed with another email from her FBI source. This one contained more recent information. Surveillance photos, financial records, known associates. Whitaker was 73 now, still running his construction empire from a compound outside of Amarillo. Still wealthy, still connected, still dangerous. But what made Madison's blood freeze was the last attachment. A surveillance photo from just 2 weeks ago, taken outside St. Raphael Hospital in Dallas. A black SUV with tinted windows parked across from the main entrance. The license plate was registered to a shell company owned by Whitaker Construction. Oh shit, Madison breathed. What? Richard, I think they're already watching her. I think they've been watching Isabella. The implications hit them both at the same time. If Whitaker's people were monitoring Isabella, then they knew about Richard's accident, about his interaction with her, about the questions he'd been asking. They might even know about Madison's investigation. We need to be very careful here, Madison said, her journalist's instincts warring with her growing fear. If we spook them, if they think Isabella is becoming a liability, they'll move her, or worse. Madison was already grabbing her car keys. I'm going back to Dallas. We need to figure out how to approach this without getting Isabella killed. What about Whitaker? What about him? If he's been watching Isabella, then he knows she's Caroline's daughter. He's known all along. Richard's voice was getting stronger, the businessman and protector replacing the grieving brother, which means Caroline is still alive, and he's still using her to keep his secrets safe. Madison paused at her apartment door. Richard, if we're right about this, if we can prove Whitaker kidnapped Caroline and has been holding her all these years, then we're going to bring that bastard down. All the way down. As Madison drove through the Texas night toward Dallas, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every set of headlights in her rearview mirror looked suspicious. Every car that took the same exit seemed like a potential threat. Somewhere out there, Donald Whitaker was sitting in his compound, probably congratulating himself on 30 years of getting away with the perfect crime. But perfect crimes had a way of unraveling when people started asking the right questions. And Madison Price was very good at asking questions. Behind her, 50 miles back on the same highway, a black SUV maintained a careful distance, its driver speaking quietly into a radio. She's heading back to Dallas. Should we intercept? The voice that answered was gravelly, tired, but absolutely certain. Not yet. Let her run. See what she digs up, but Matthew... Yeah, boss. If she gets too close to the truth, shut it down, all of it. Matthew Crowe adjusted his grip on the steering wheel and pressed the accelerator. After 30 years of cleaning up Donald Whitaker's messes, he was very good at shutting things down. The doorbell of Richard's Highland Park mansion rang at exactly 7 in the morning, its chimes echoing through rooms that had felt empty for 30 years. Richard had been awake since 4, pacing the marble floors of his study, waiting for this moment with the kind of nervous energy that made his hands shake and his coffee grow cold. Dolores Franklin stood on his doorstep like a ghost from his childhood, smaller than he remembered, her dark hair now silver white, her face lined with decades of worry. She clutched a worn leather purse against her chest like a shield. Mrs. Franklin. Richard's voice caught in his throat. Thank you for coming. She nodded once, sharp and efficient, the same way she used to acknowledge his mother's instructions 30 years ago. Mr. Richard, you look just like your father when he was your age. They sat in the same study where Robert Calloway had once planned his testimony against Donald Whitaker, where he'd made the decision that would cost him everything. Dolores perched on the edge of an antique chair, her purse still clutched in her lap, her dark eyes studying Richard with an intensity that made him feel like a child again. You said on the phone you had something that belonged to my family, Richard said gently. Dolores's hands trembled as she opened her purse. I've carried this burden for 26 years, Mr. Richard. Every day, I thought about coming forward. Every day, I found a reason not to. She pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, the handwriting on the front faded but still legible. For Dolores Franklin, when the time is right. Your sister gave this to me 3 days before she had her baby. She was 16 then, living in that place where they kept her. She knew she didn't have much time left. Richard's heart stopped. Caroline was alive when she wrote this. Alive, but barely hanging on. That man, Whitaker, he'd moved her to different places over the years. Farms, warehouses, always moving when he thought people were getting close. But this last place, outside of Beaumont, it was different. It was where he took the girls he planned to keep long-term. Dolores's voice dropped to a whisper. There were others, Mr. Richard. Not many, but others. Girls who'd been taken for different reasons. All of them trapped by whatever secrets Whitaker needed to protect. Richard's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Caroline's careful handwriting, the same script he remembered from birthday cards and school assignments, but shakier now, desperate. Dolores, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I need you to do something important. I'm going to have a baby soon. A little girl. I'm going to call her Isabella, after Grandma Rose. I know that sounds crazy. Planning a name for a baby I might never get to raise, but it gives me hope. Whitaker says he's going to move her somewhere safe. Away from all this, he says. If I cooperate, if I never try to contact my family, he'll let her live a normal life. I don't trust him, but I don't have a choice. There's a bracelet, the one Richie gave me for my 10th birthday. I want Isabella to have it. When she's old enough, when it's safe, I want her to know where she comes from. I want her to know that her mother loved her enough to let her go. Dolores, I know this is asking a lot, but if something happens to me, please make sure she gets somewhere safe. Somewhere far from here. And if you ever get the chance, if it's ever safe, please tell my family that I never stopped thinking about them. I never stopped loving them. Caroline Pease. There's a notebook hidden in the kitchen wall of the Beaumont house, behind the loose brick by the window. It has names, dates, money transfers, everything Whitaker didn't want anyone to find. If something happens to me, it might be the only way to stop him. Richard's vision blurred as he read the letter twice, 3 times. Memorizing every word, Caroline had been alive at 16. She'd had a baby. She'd thought about him, about their family, even in the worst moments of her captivity. What happened? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dolores pulled out a second item from her purse, a small, weathered notebook bound with a rubber band. Caroline went into labor 2 weeks after she gave me that letter. It was a difficult birth, and she lost a lot of blood. Whitaker brought in a doctor, but it was too late. She made me promise to take the baby and run. She died. I thought she did. The doctor said she was gone, and Whitaker was already making plans to dispose of. Dolores couldn't finish the sentence. But I took Isabella and ran, drove straight to San Antonio, left her at St. Lucy's with the letter Caroline had written for her and that ruby bracelet. Richard's world was spinning. You thought Caroline was dead. For 26 years, yes. Dolores's voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. Until last month. What? Dolores pulled out a third item, a newspaper clipping from the Houston Chronicle, dated just 4 weeks ago. It was a small article about a local charity drive, but one of the volunteers in the accompanying photo made Richard's breath catch in his throat. The woman was older, thinner, her hair darker than he remembered, but the eyes were the same, the shape of her face, the way she held her shoulders. Everything about her screamed Caroline Calloway. She's alive, Richard breathed. She's alive, but she's dying. Dolores's voice was matter of fact, the way she used to announce dinner or report on household emergencies. Kidney disease, probably from whatever they did to her in those places over the years. She's getting treatment at a clinic in Houston, using the name Elaine Parker. Richard stared at the photo until his eyes burned. His sister, his little sister who'd been 10 years old when she vanished, was alive. 40 years old now, sick and alone, but alive. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. Because I'm dying too. Dolores opened her coat to reveal a hospital bracelet around her wrist. Pancreatic cancer. I've got maybe 2 months left, and I can't take these secrets with me to my grave. She gestured to the notebook. That contains everything Caroline found in Whitaker's records, bank transfers, bribes, names of politicians and judges who were on his payroll, even details about other girls he took over the years. It's enough to destroy him completely. Richard picked up the notebook with reverent care. It was filled with Caroline's handwriting. Lists of names, dates, dollar amounts. A complete record of Donald Whitaker's criminal empire, compiled by a 16-year-old girl who'd somehow found the courage to fight back even in captivity. There's one more thing, Dolores said. Caroline doesn't know about Isabella. Whitaker told her the baby died in childbirth. She spent 25 years believing her daughter is dead. The cruelty of it hit Richard like a physical blow. Whitaker hadn't just stolen Caroline from her family. He'd stolen Isabella from Caroline, then convinced her the baby had died. It was a level of psychological torture that defied comprehension. Mr. Richard, Dolores continued, I need you to understand something. If you try to contact Caroline, if you try to expose Whitaker, he'll know. He's got people watching, always watching. He spent 30 years building a network that protects him from exactly this kind of threat. So what do you suggest? Be smart. Be careful. That girl, Isabella, she's in danger just by existing. If Whitaker realizes she's grown up, if he thinks she might remember something or ask the wrong questions, Dolores shook her head. He won't hesitate to eliminate the threat. After Dolores left, Richard sat alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his family's destruction. The letter, the notebook, the newspaper clipping, pieces of a puzzle that had taken 30 years to assemble. His phone buzzed with a text from Madison. Need to talk. Found something big. Richard looked at Caroline's letter one more time, at her careful words about love and sacrifice and hope. Then he picked up his phone and dialed. Madison, I think it's time we had a very serious conversation. Outside, a black SUV drove slowly past the mansion's gates, the driver speaking quietly into a radio. After 30 years of silence, the Calloway family was asking questions again, and Matthew Crow was very good at providing answers. The genetic testing lab on Commerce Street looked more like a tech startup than a medical facility. All glass walls and modern furniture, designed to make the most invasive questions feel casual and routine. Richard sat in the waiting area, his leg bouncing with nervous energy as he watched Isabella fill out paperwork at the reception desk. She'd agreed to the testing with surprising ease when he'd approached her during her lunch break at St. Raphael. He'd crafted a story about a rare genetic condition that ran in his family, something that could affect distant relatives. Isabella had listened with the professional concern of a nurse who'd seen too many families torn apart by inherited diseases. It's smart to be proactive, she'd said, already reaching for her jacket. Genetic screening can catch things early, give people options they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, watching her sign consent forms with steady hands, Richard wondered if she had any idea how dramatically her life was about to change. In 48 hours, they'd have scientific proof of what his heart already knew, that Isabella Moore was his niece, Caroline's daughter, the missing piece of a puzzle that had consumed 30 years of his life. Mr. Calloway, the lab technician, was young, efficient, with the kind of cheerful professionalism that made drawing blood feel like a social event. "We're ready for you." The actual process took less than 10 minutes. A few vials of blood, some cheek swabs, signatures on a dozen different forms. Isabella chatted easily with the technician about her work at the hospital, her plans for the weekend, the weather, normal conversation from a normal life that was about to become anything but normal. Results should be ready in 48 hours, the technician told them as they prepared to leave. "We'll call with preliminary findings, and you can pick up the full report anytime after that." Outside on the sidewalk, Isabella turned to Richard with a smile that made his chest tight with emotion. "Thank you for including me in this. It's not every day someone cares enough about a stranger's health to pay for genetic testing." "You're not a stranger," Richard said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Isabella tilted her head, studying his face with those dark eyes that looked so much like Caroline's. "What do you mean?" Richard's mind raced. Too much, too soon. He forced a smile. "I just mean, you took such good care of me at the hospital. It didn't feel like you were a stranger." She seemed to accept that, nodding as she checked her watch. "I should get back. My shift starts in an hour." Richard watched her walk away, noting the way she moved, confident but careful, like someone who'd learned early to navigate the world on her own, just like Caroline had been at that age. Before Whitaker destroyed everything, his phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Meet me at my office now." Madison's downtown office looked like a war room. The walls were covered with printed photos, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn timelines connecting names and dates with red string. At the center of it all was a large map of Texas with dozens of pins marking locations, Whitaker properties, shell company addresses, places where other missing persons cases might be connected. "Jesus, Madison, how long have you been working on this?" "Since you called yesterday. I've got contacts at the FBI, the state police, even some federal marshals who remember the original investigation." Madison gestured to a thick stack of files on her desk. "Richard, this is so much bigger than we thought." She pulled out a series of surveillance photos, each showing the same black SUV at different locations around Dallas, outside Isabella's apartment building, in the hospital parking lot, following Madison's car on 3 separate occasions. "They're not just watching Isabella," Madison said. "They're watching all of us." Richard studied the photos, his businessman's mind automatically calculating angles and risks. "How long?" "At least 2 weeks that I can document. Probably longer." Madison pulled out another file. "But here's the thing that really scares me. I found records of similar surveillance going back years, different vehicles, different operators, but the pattern is the same. They've been keeping tabs on Isabella her entire adult life. Why? Because she's leverage? As long as she exists, as long as Caroline knows her daughter is out there living a normal life, Caroline will do whatever Whitaker wants to keep it that way." Madison's voice was grim. "It's the perfect prison. Caroline can't escape without abandoning her daughter, and she can't contact Isabella without putting her in danger." Richard sank into a chair, the weight of 30 years of manipulation settling on his shoulders like lead. "What about Caroline? Any luck tracking her down in Houston?" Madison nodded, pulling out a medical file that she definitely shouldn't have had access to. Elaine Parker, age 40, receiving hemodialysis at the Memorial Hermann Medical Center 3 times a week. She pays cash, has no insurance, and her medical records start in 2010, like she didn't exist before then. "But you're sure it's her?" "Richard, look at this." Madison handed him a high-resolution photo taken with a telephoto lens. It showed a woman walking into the medical center, her face clearly visible in profile. Richard's breath caught. It was Caroline, older, thinner, marked by years of hardship, but unmistakably, his sister. The same stubborn jawline, the same way of holding her shoulders when she was determined about something. She was alive, and she was 20 minutes away in Houston. "I want to see her," Richard said immediately. "Absolutely not." Madison's voice was sharp. "Richard, Think about this logically. If you approach Caroline directly, if Whitaker's people see you together, what do you think happens to Isabella? Richard knew she was right, but the knowledge felt like swallowing glass. Caroline was so close, closer than she'd been in 30 years, and he still couldn't reach her. There's something else, Madison continued. I've been tracking Whitaker's financial records through his shell companies. The man has been moving serious money around lately, liquidating assets, closing accounts, transferring funds offshore. What does that mean? It means he's preparing for something. Either he's getting ready to run, or he's planning to tie up loose ends permanently. Madison's expression was grim. Either way, it's not good news for Caroline or Isabella. Richard's phone rang, the ringtone cutting through the tension in the room. The caller ID showed the genetic testing lab. Already? Madison raised an eyebrow. They said 48 hours. Richard answered on the third ring. This is Richard Calloway. Mr. Calloway, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the genetics lab. I'm calling about the avuncular testing you requested. Yes. Sir, I'm not sure if there was some confusion about the samples, but we've run the test twice now with the same results. The probability of avuncular relationship between you and Isabella Moore is 99.7%. Richard closed his eyes, feeling 30 years of hope and fear crystallize into scientific certainty. You're sure? Yes, sir, barring any laboratory error, which we've ruled out. Ms. Moore is definitely your biological niece. After hanging up, Richard sat in silence for a long moment. Madison waited, understanding that he needed time to process what they'd just confirmed. It's her, he said finally. Isabella is Caroline's daughter. So what do we do now? Richard stood up, his mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had built his business empire. Now we get smart about this. We can't approach Caroline directly, and we can't tell Isabella the truth until we're sure she's safe. But we can start building a case against Whitaker. How? We use Caroline's notebook, we verify the names, trace the money transfers, build a paper trail that even his political connections can't ignore. Richard pulled out his phone. I've got contacts at the Justice Department, people who owe me favors. If we can present them with enough evidence, they'll have to act. Madison finished. Even if Whitaker has been untouchable for 30 years. Exactly, but we need to be careful. One wrong move, and Whitaker could decide that Caroline and Isabella are more liability than leverage. Madison gathered up the files, already making mental lists of sources to contact and leads to follow. This is going to be dangerous, Richard, for all of us. I know. Richard looked at the photo of Caroline one more time, memorizing her face. But she's been waiting 30 years for someone to come looking for her. I'm not going to let her wait any longer. Outside Madison's office, Matthew Crowe sat in his SUV, watching through binoculars as Richard and Madison shook hands and went their separate ways. He picked up his radio. They're moving faster than expected, he reported. What are your orders? The response crackled through the static. Let them run a little longer, but Matthew, start making contingency plans. If this gets out of hand, we might need to accelerate our timeline. Matthew understood. After 30 years of keeping Donald Whitaker's secrets, he knew exactly what accelerating the timeline meant. The Memorial Hermann Medical Center in Houston hummed with the quiet efficiency of a place where people came to fight for their lives. Richard sat in his rental car across the street, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. For 3 hours, he'd been watching the dialysis center entrance, waiting for a woman named Elaine Parker, who was really his sister Caroline. Madison sat in the passenger seat, her camera ready, though they'd agreed no photos unless absolutely necessary. You don't have to do this today, she said for the third time. We could wait, plan this better. I've waited 30 years. Richard's voice was hoarse. I'm not waiting another day. At 2:47 p.m. she appeared, Caroline. Because despite the false name and the decades of separation, Richard knew his sister instantly, walked slowly toward the medical center entrance. She moved carefully, like someone whose body had betrayed her in fundamental ways. Her dark hair was shorter than he remembered, streaked with gray, and she was thinner than any 40-year-old should be. But her profile, the way she held her shoulders, the stubborn set of her jaw when she was determined about something, all of it was exactly as he remembered. That's her, he whispered. Madison squinted through the telephoto lens. You're sure? I'm sure. Richard was out of the car before Madison could stop him. his legs carrying him across the busy street without conscious thought. 30 years of grief and guilt and desperate hope had collapsed into this single moment, and nothing else mattered. Caroline was fumbling with her purse at the entrance, trying to find her insurance card, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up, probably expecting to see another patient, or maybe a helpful nurse. Instead, she found herself staring into the face of her older brother, aged by 3 decades, but unmistakably Richard. The color drained from her face. Her purse slipped from nerveless fingers, spilling contents across the sidewalk. For a moment that lasted forever, they just stared at each other. "Richie?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Hello, Caroline." She looked around frantically, her eyes wide with terror. "You can't be here, you can't. If they see you..." "Caroline, it's okay." Richard stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's going to be okay." "No, you don't understand." Caroline was backing toward the building, her breathing rapid and shallow. "They watch. They're always watching if they see us together." "Who, Caroline? Whitaker? He can't hurt you anymore." At the sound of Whitaker's name, Caroline's legs buckled. Richard caught her before she hit the ground, and suddenly she was in his arms for the first time in 30 years. She felt fragile, like she might break if he held her too tightly, but she was real and alive. And finally home. "You're not supposed to be here," she sobbed against his shoulder. "You're supposed to be safe." "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Richard's own voice was thick with tears he'd been holding back for decades. "I've been looking for you, Caroline, every day for 30 years. They held each other on the sidewalk outside the medical center, oblivious to the stares of passing strangers. Madison watched from across the street, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed a reunion she'd helped orchestrate, but never truly believed would happen. Eventually, Caroline pulled back, wiping her eyes with shaking hands. "How did you find me?" "It's a long story." Richard glanced around, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "Can we go somewhere private? Somewhere we can talk?" Caroline shook her head immediately. "No, nowhere public. They have people everywhere, Richard. You don't understand. They never stopped watching our family. They know about your business, your house, your friends. They probably already know you're here." "Then we'll make this fast." Richard helped her gather the contents of her spilled purse. "Caroline, I need you to know. Isabella is alive." Caroline froze, a tube of lipstick halfway to her purse. "What?" "Your daughter, Isabella. She's alive. She's 25 years old, and she's a nurse at St. Raphael Hospital in Dallas." The lipstick fell from Caroline's fingers. "That's not possible. She died," the doctor said. "Whitaker told me she died during birth." Whitaker lied. Richard pulled out his phone, showing her the photo he'd taken of Isabella's hospital ID badge. "Her name is Isabella Moore. She was raised at St. Lucy's Home for Children in San Antonio. And Caroline, she's wearing your bracelet." Caroline stared at the photo with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every pixel. Her daughter, the baby she'd held for 30 minutes before Whitaker's doctor declared her dead, was alive, beautiful, a nurse, saving lives, carrying on the family tradition of taking care of others. "She looks like Mom," Caroline whispered. "She looks like you." Richard put his arm around his sister's shoulders. "Caroline, there's more. We have evidence against Whitaker. The notebook you hid in Beaumont. Dolores Franklin kept it safe all these years. We can stop him." "Dolores?" Caroline's eyes widened. "Is she?" "Dying cancer. But she held on to your evidence, Caroline. 26 years she carried that burden, waiting for the right moment to act." Caroline was quiet for a long time, processing information that was reshaping everything she'd believed about her life. Her daughter was alive. Her family had never stopped looking for her. The evidence she'd risked everything to gather might finally bring down the man who'd stolen her childhood. "He told me you'd given up," she said finally. "Said the family had moved on, forgotten about me. Said if I ever tried to contact you, he'd kill everyone I loved. We never gave up. Dad tried until the day he died. I've spent my entire adult life looking for you." "Dad's dead." Caroline's voice broke on the words. Richard nodded. "Heart attack, 10 years ago. But Caroline, he never stopped believing you were alive. Never stopped hoping." They sat together on a bench outside the medical center, 30 years of separation collapsing into urgent conversation. Caroline told him about the years of captivity, the constant moving, The other girls who disappeared when they became too much trouble. She told him about the pregnancy, about believing her daughter had died, about the kidney disease that was slowly killing her. Richard told her about the business empire he'd built while searching for her, about the investigators and false leads and sleepless nights. He told her about Isabella, about her kindness and competence and the way she'd saved his life without knowing who he was. "She doesn't know?" Caroline asked. "Not yet. We wanted to be sure you were safe first." "I'm not safe. I'll never be safe as long as Whitaker is alive." Caroline's voice was matter-of-fact. "But maybe it doesn't matter anymore. If Isabella is alive, if she's happy, maybe that's enough." "It's not enough." Richard's voice was firm. "You deserve to know your daughter, Caroline. She deserves to know her mother, and Whitaker deserves to pay for what he's done." Across the street, Madison was frantically texting Richard. "Black SUV just pulled up. Get out of there now." Richard's phone buzzed with the message just as Caroline tensed beside him. "Richard," she whispered, "we need to go, now." They stood up casually, but Richard could see the fear in his sister's eyes. 30 years of conditioning had taught her to recognize danger in the tilt of a stranger's head, the positioning of a parked car, the way shadows fell across a sidewalk. "My rental car is across the street," Richard said quietly. "No, too open." Caroline was already moving, her medical appointment forgotten. "There's a service entrance around back. My car is in the employee lot." They walked quickly but calmly toward the rear of the building, Richard fighting every instinct that told him to run. Behind them, 2 men in dark suits were getting out of the black SUV, their eyes scanning the crowd with professional efficiency. "Caroline," Richard said as they reached her car, a 15-year-old Honda that had seen better decades. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much pain, but still held echoes of the little girl who used to follow him around the backyard. "I've trusted you my whole life, Richie. I'm not going to stop now. Then we're going to end this, all of it, Whitaker. The surveillance, the threats, everything. But first, I think it's time you met your daughter." St. Raphael Hospital's chapel was empty, except for the 3 of them. Richard, Madison, and Father Elias Rodriguez, the hospital chaplain who'd agreed to provide a neutral, sacred space for what Richard had described as the most important conversation of our lives. Isabella would be joining them after her shift ended at 6. Believing she was meeting to discuss the genetic testing results, Caroline sat in the back pew, her hands trembling as she clutched a small photo, the only picture she had of Isabella, taken secretly by a sympathetic nurse during one of her recent hospital visits. It showed Isabella from a distance, adjusting an IV for an elderly patient, her profile clearly visible. Caroline had stared at that photo for hours, memorizing every detail of the daughter she'd believed was dead for 25 years. "You don't have to do this all at once," Father Elias said gently. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd seen families reunited and torn apart in equal measure. Sometimes these revelations are easier to process in stages. "No," Caroline's voice was barely a whisper. "I've waited 25 years to meet my daughter. I won't wait another day." Richard checked his phone. 5:58 p.m. "She'll be here any minute." "What if she hates me?" Caroline's voice cracked. "What if she thinks I abandoned her? What if—" "She won't," Madison said firmly. "I've been watching Isabella for weeks. She's exactly the kind of person who understands that sometimes people make impossible choices for love." The chapel door opened with a soft creak, and Isabella stepped inside, still wearing her scrubs from the evening shift. She looked tired but alert, her dark eyes scanning the small group with professional curiosity. "Mr. Calloway." She approached their pew, her gaze moving from Richard to Madison to Father Elias, then finally settling on Caroline. "I'm sorry I'm late. We had an emergency on the cardiac unit." Richard stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Isabella, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." She slid into the pew next to Richard, her presence immediately transforming the space. Caroline couldn't take her eyes off her daughter, the way Isabella moved with quiet confidence, the familiar tilt of her head when she was listening, the ruby bracelet that caught the chapel's soft lighting. "Is this about the genetic testing?" Isabella asked. "The lab called this morning and said you'd requested the full results be delivered in person." "In a way, yes." Richard's voice was steady, though his hands were shaking. "Isabella, What I'm about to tell you is going to change everything you thought you knew about your life, about your family, about who you are. Isabella's expression shifted to the careful neutrality she used with anxious family members in the hospital. Okay, the genetic testing confirmed that you are my biological niece. Richard paused, letting that sink in. Your mother is my sister Caroline, who was kidnapped from our backyard 30 years ago when she was 10 years old. The silence in the chapel was absolute. Isabella stared at Richard, her mind clearly working to process information that didn't fit with anything she'd believed about herself. That's not possible, she said finally. I was abandoned at an orphanage. My parents, whoever they were, left me there when I was 2. You were left there by someone who was trying to save your life, Richard said gently. Isabella, your mother didn't abandon you. She was forced to give you up to protect you from the man who kidnapped her. Isabella's gaze moved to Caroline, really seeing her for the first time. Caroline had tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling, the first genuine smile Richard had seen from her in 30 years. Hello, Isabella, Caroline said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm your mother. The words hung in the air like a prayer. Isabella looked from Caroline to Richard to Madison, her nurse's training warring with emotions she couldn't process. This is crazy. You're saying that I'm related to you, that this woman is my mother. I know it sounds impossible, Richard said, but we have DNA evidence, documentation, witnesses. Isabella, everything we're telling you is true. Isabella stood up abruptly, pacing to the chapel's small altar. Even if this is true, and I'm not saying I believe it, where have you been for 25 years? Why didn't you look for me? We did look for you, Richard said. I've spent my entire adult life looking for both of you. But the man who took Caroline, Donald Whitaker, he's powerful, connected. He's been hiding you from us, and hiding us from you, and your mother, Madison added gently. She thought you had died during childbirth. Whitaker told her you were dead. She's been mourning you for 25 years. Isabella turned to face Caroline, studying her with the intense focus she usually reserved for critical patients. You thought I was dead? Caroline nodded, unable to speak. But I've been alive this whole time, working, studying, becoming a nurse. I've been 20 minutes away from you in Dallas for the past year. I didn't know, Caroline whispered. I swear to you, Isabella, I didn't know. Isabella returned to the pew, sitting down heavily. She pulled off the ruby bracelet, holding it up to the light. Sister Margaret at the orphanage said this was with me when I arrived. She said there was a note that said, "For my little Isa. When she comes home," Caroline's breath caught. You remember that? Sister Margaret told me about it when I turned 18. I always wondered what it meant. Isabella looked at the bracelet, then at Caroline. You wrote that note? Yes. Caroline reached into her purse, pulling out a folded piece of paper. I wrote this for you too, right before you were born. I never thought you'd get to read it. Isabella unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a letter written in the same careful handwriting as the note Dolores had delivered to Richard. My beautiful Isabella, if you're reading this, then somehow, some way, we found our way back to each other. I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most important. You deserved a chance at a real life, a safe life, away from the darkness that surrounded me. I named you after your great-grandmother Rose Isabella Calloway, who was the strongest woman I ever knew. I hope you grow up to be strong like her, kind like her, brave like her. I love you more than words can say. I love you enough to let you go. Your mother. Caroline Isabella read the letter twice, her hands shaking. When she looked up, tears were streaming down her face. This is real. This is actually real. It's real, Richard confirmed. Isabella, you have a family. You have a mother who has never stopped loving you, and an uncle who has never stopped looking for you. And what about him, this Whitaker person? What happens when he finds out you've told me the truth? The question hung in the air like a threat. Richard and Madison exchanged glances. They'd known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. We're going to stop him, Richard said. We have evidence of his crimes, proof of what he's done. We're going to make sure he can never hurt anyone again. Isabella looked at Caroline, really seeing her for the first time as her mother, rather than a stranger. Are you sick? You look... You look like some of my patients. Caroline smiled sadly. Kidney disease, probably caused by everything that happened over the years. Without hesitation, Isabella moved to sit next to Caroline, taking her hands in the gentle, professional grip of a nurse assessing a patient. What's your GFR? Are you on the transplant list? What kind of treatment are you receiving? Isabella, Caroline said softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Isabella's voice was firm. You're my mother. Taking care of you is exactly what I have to do. Father Elias, who had been silently watching the reunion unfold, cleared his throat. If I may say something, I've presided over many family reunions in my years here. I've seen families torn apart by secrets and brought together by truth. What I see here is a family that was broken by evil, but love has kept the pieces intact. Caroline reached up to touch Isabella's face, her fingers tracing the features she'd only seen in one stolen photograph. You're so beautiful. You're everything I dreamed you would be. Isabella leaned into her mother's touch. I have so many questions. We have time for answers, Richard said. All the time in the world. Outside the chapel. In the hospital parking lot. Matthew Crowe spoke quietly into his radio. They're all together now, Calloway. The girl, and the woman from Houston. How long have they been talking? About an hour, should I move in? There was a long pause before the response came through. Not yet. Let them have their reunion. But Matthew, start preparing the final solution. If we can't control this situation anymore, we're going to have to end it. The storm that hit Dallas that Tuesday night came without warning. The kind of Texas weather that turned the sky black and sent emergency rooms into overdrive. Isabella had volunteered to stay for a double shift, knowing that nights like this brought car accidents, heart attacks, and all the chaos that came with people fighting against nature. She moved through the corridors of St. Raphael with practiced efficiency, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation in the chapel 3 days earlier. 3 days since she'd learned she had a mother and an uncle. 3 days since her entire understanding of herself had been rewritten. Caroline had been staying at Richard's house since the reunion, sleeping in the guest room that had been empty for 30 years. They'd spent hours talking about Isabella's childhood at the orphanage, about Caroline's years in captivity, about the life they might have had together. It felt like trying to compress 25 years of missed conversations into a few precious days. But tonight, Caroline had insisted on returning to Houston for her scheduled dialysis appointment. I can't miss treatments, she'd told them. My kidneys are barely functioning as it is. Richard had wanted to drive her himself, but Caroline had refused. The less we're seen together in public, the better, at least until we figure out how to handle Whitaker. So she'd taken the bus back to Houston, promising to call when she was safely at the medical center. That call should have come 2 hours ago. Isabella was checking on a patient in the cardiac unit when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. If you want to see your mother alive, come to the parking garage. Level 3. Come alone. Her blood turned to ice. Isabella stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the words fully registered. Someone had Caroline. Someone knew about their reunion, about their relationship. Whitaker. Isabella's hands were shaking as she dialed Richard's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried Madison next. Same result. Father Elias, the security desk, even the Dallas police non-emergency line. Every call went unanswered, like the storm had swallowed all communication. Another text arrived. 5 minutes, level 3, or she dies. Isabella looked around the bustling emergency room, at her colleagues saving lives and fighting death with the same dedication she'd shown for the past year. She thought about calling for help, about alerting hospital security, about doing any of the smart, safe things her training had taught her. Instead, she grabbed her jacket and headed for the elevator. Level 3 of the parking garage was nearly empty, most cars having fled before the storm hit its peak. Isabella's footsteps echoed in the concrete space as she walked slowly toward the far end, where a black SUV sat under a broken light fixture. The back door opened as she approached, and Matthew Crowe stepped out. He was a big man, probably in his 50s, with the kind of build that suggested he'd spent years doing physical work. His smile was friendly, almost apologetic. Ms. Moore, thank you for coming. I'm sorry about the dramatic circumstances, but my employer is very eager to meet you. Where's my mother? Isabella's voice was steadier than she felt. Safe, for now. Crowe gestured toward the SUV. Mr. Whitaker would like to have a conversation with you, just a conversation. And if I refuse? Crow's smile didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Then your mother's dialysis treatments become significantly more complicated. Kidney patients are so fragile. You understand? One small mistake with the machine settings. Isabella understood. She'd seen enough dialysis patients to know how delicate the process was. How many things could go wrong if someone wanted them to go wrong? She got into the SUV. The drive through the storm-lashed streets of Dallas felt like a journey into hell. Crow drove in silence while Isabella tried to calculate escape routes and contact options. Her phone had no signal, probably a jammer in the vehicle. And the rain was coming down so hard she couldn't see out the windows clearly enough to note landmarks. They eventually stopped at what looked like an abandoned warehouse in an industrial district Isabella didn't recognize. Crow led her through a maze of empty corridors to a small office where Donald Whitaker was waiting. At 73, Whitaker was still an imposing figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that had made him millions in the construction business. He sat behind a desk that looked out of place in the warehouse setting, studying Isabella with pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "The famous Isabella Moore," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "You know, I've been keeping an eye on you for years. You've turned out quite well. Where's my mother?" "Right to the point. I like that." Whitaker gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." Isabella remained standing. "I'm not discussing anything until I know Caroline is safe." Whitaker chuckled. "Caroline? It's been years since anyone called her that. She's been Elaine Parker for so long. I sometimes forget she ever had another name." He pressed a button on his desk, and a monitor descended from the ceiling. The screen showed a live feed from what appeared to be a medical facility. Caroline strapped to a dialysis machine, unconscious, with a man in scrubs monitoring the equipment. "As you can see, your mother is receiving her treatment as scheduled. The question is whether she receives all of it." Whitaker's eyes never left Isabella's face. "You see, dialysis is a delicate process. Too much fluid removal, and the patient goes into shock. Too little, and the toxins build up. Either way can be fatal." Isabella's medical training kicked in automatically. "You're monsters. I'm a businessman who's spent 30 years protecting a very valuable investment." Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "Your mother has been keeping my secrets safe for 3 decades. The arrangement has worked well for everyone involved. Everyone except Caroline. Everyone except me. But you've had a wonderful life, haven't you? Good education, meaningful career, the satisfaction of helping others. All of that was possible because your mother made a deal with me." Isabella's hands clenched into fists. "What deal?" "Complete silence about certain business arrangements in exchange for your safety and her life. Simple, elegant, effective." Whitaker smiled. "Unfortunately, your recent reunion with Richard Calloway has complicated that arrangement considerably." The warehouse lights flickered as thunder crashed overhead. Isabella could hear rain hammering against the metal roof like bullets. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want you to convince your newfound family to stop digging into my business. Richard has hired investigators. That journalist woman has been asking uncomfortable questions. And frankly, it's becoming disruptive to my operations. And if we don't stop..." Whitaker gestured to the monitor, where Caroline remained unconscious on the dialysis machine. "Then your mother's treatment becomes permanently interrupted, and you, my dear, disappear just like she did 30 years ago." Isabella stared at the screen, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with mechanical regularity. She thought about the letter Caroline had written before her birth, about the sacrifice and love that had shaped both their lives. "You can't keep doing this forever," she said. "Eventually, someone will what? Stop me." Whitaker laughed. "Child, I've been untouchable for 30 years. I have judges, politicians, law enforcement officials who owe me favors going back decades. Your uncle's money and influence don't scare me." Isabella's phone suddenly buzzed in her pocket. Somehow, she had signal again. She glanced at it quickly. A text from Richard saying simply, "Trust Madison. You seem to have regained communication," Whitaker observed. "How convenient." Another text arrived. This one from Madison. "Keep him talking. We're tracing the signal." Isabella looked up to find Whitaker watching her with amused interest. You really think your friends can save you? I think you're not as untouchable as you believe. At that moment, the warehouse lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness except for the glow from the monitor showing Caroline. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. What the hell? Whitaker started to say, but he was cut off by the sound of sirens in the distance. Growing louder, Crow appeared in the doorway, breathing hard. Boss, we've got problems. Multiple police units approaching from the east, FBI vehicles from the west. Someone set us up. Whitaker's face went dark with rage. Impossible. We jammed all communications. Isabella smiled grimly. You jammed cellular signals. You didn't think about the hospital's emergency radio system. The truth was, Isabella had no idea how Madison and Richard had found her, but she'd learned enough about Donald Whitaker in the past hour to know that his greatest weakness was his arrogance, his absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone around him. Get the car ready, Whitaker snapped at Crow. We're leaving. Bring the girl. What about the woman in Houston? Whitaker looked at the monitor showing Caroline, his expression calculating. End the treatment permanently. No! Isabella lunged forward, but Crow caught her arm. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, I think that treatment's going to continue exactly as prescribed. Richard Calloway stepped into the office, followed by Madison and 2 FBI agents. He looked at Isabella with relief and concern. Are you hurt? I'm fine, but Caroline is safe, Madison said, holding up her phone. We had federal agents at the Houston facility before you even got here. Your mother is under federal protection now. Whitaker stared at them with the expression of a man watching his empire crumble. This is impossible. You can't have Caroline's notebook, Richard said simply. 30 years of your crimes, documented in her handwriting, bank records, bribery payments, the names of every official you've corrupted. It's all there, Donald. Every last detail. The dawn after the storm broke clear and bright over Dallas. As if the city itself was exhaling after holding its breath for 30 years, Isabella stood at the window of Richard's study, watching news vans line the street outside his Highland Park mansion. The story had broken at 3 a.m., and by sunrise, every major network was running the headline. Texas construction magnate arrested in decades-long kidnapping and corruption scandal. Madison sat at Richard's desk, fielding calls from reporters, federal prosecutors, and her own editor. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the FBI had released their preliminary statement. This wasn't just a local crime story anymore. It was national news. The Justice Department wants to hold a press conference this afternoon, Madison said, covering her phone's mouthpiece. They're calling it one of the largest corruption cases in Texas history. Richard paced the room like a caged animal. Even with Whitaker in federal custody and Caroline under protection, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. 30 years of waiting for this moment. And now that it was here, he felt strangely empty. Have you heard from the hospital in Houston? He asked Isabella. Every hour on the hour, Isabella held up her phone, showing a text from Caroline's medical team. Her vitals are stable. The dialysis treatment yesterday was successful despite everything she's asking when she can see us. Soon, Richard promised. As soon as the FBI clears us to travel, the front door chimed, and they heard footsteps in the hallway. Agent Sarah Chen appeared in the study doorway, looking like she hadn't slept in 36 hours. She'd been the lead investigator on the case, coordinating with local police, federal prosecutors, and the Texas Rangers. We got him, she announced without preamble. Whitaker's talking, not because he wants to. His lawyers are furious, but because we have so much evidence he knows fighting it is pointless. Madison looked up from her phone. What's he saying? Everything. Names, dates, payoff amounts. He's implicating judges, city councilmen, state legislators, even a few federal officials. Agent Chen sat down heavily in one of Richard's leather chairs. This investigation is going to take years to unwind completely. What about the other girls? Isabella asked quietly. Caroline said there were others over the years. Agent Chen's expression grew grim. We're working on that. Whitaker's given us locations of several properties where he held people, some of them. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Some of them won't have happy endings, but we're hopeful about finding survivors. Richard stopped pacing. What about Crow? Matthew Crow is singing like a bird. 30 years of running Whitaker's dirty work. And he's got stories that would curl your hair. He's agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. Isabella moved away from the window, unable to watch the media circus any longer. When can we see Caroline? That's actually why I'm here. Agent Chen pulled out a manila folder. The federal prosecutor wants to prepare her for her testimony, but she's refusing to cooperate until she sees her family. Since you're all key witnesses anyway, we've arranged for a protected reunion. Where? Secure wing of the Methodist Hospital in Houston. Caroline will continue her medical treatment while we prep for the trial. Agent Chen handed Richard a set of papers. You'll need to sign these witness protection agreements. Nothing permanent. Just until we're sure all of Whitaker's associates are accounted for. Richard scanned the documents. How long? Maybe a few weeks. Whitaker had a lot of tentacles in a lot of places. We want to be absolutely certain that everyone who might want to silence witnesses is behind bars before we lift the protection. After Agent Chen left, the three of them sat in Richard's study, processing the magnitude of what was happening. Isabella kept staring at her phone, at the photos Caroline had texted her from the hospital room, selfies of her smiling, despite the IV lines and monitoring equipment. It doesn't feel real, Isabella said finally. 3 days ago, I thought I was an orphan with no family. Now I have a mother and an uncle, and I'm apparently a key witness in a federal corruption case. How are you handling it? Madison asked. Really? Isabella considered the question. I keep thinking about all the patients I've treated over the years who didn't have family. People who died alone because they had no one to hold their hand or advocate for them. And I was one of those people. Except I wasn't. I had family who never stopped looking for me. Richard's phone rang. The caller ID showed a Houston number. Caroline, he answered. Richie. Her voice was stronger than it had been in days, energized by hope and medical treatment. I just saw the news. Is it really over? It's really over. Whitaker's in federal custody. His whole network is falling apart. And Isabella, is she safe? Richard looked at his niece, who was listening to every word with the intense focus of someone still learning to believe in happy endings. She's right here. Do you want to talk to her? Isabella took the phone with trembling hands. Mom. The word still felt strange in her mouth, but it was getting easier each time she said it. My beautiful girl. Are you okay? Did they hurt you? I'm fine. Scared, but fine. Isabella wiped tears from her eyes. How are you feeling? Better than I have in years. The doctors here say I'm responding well to treatment. And Isabella, they think I might be a candidate for a kidney transplant. Isabella's medical training kicked in immediately. What's your GFR? Have they done compatibility testing? What about... Caroline's laugh interrupted her questions. Slow down, Dr. Moore. We'll have plenty of time to discuss treatment options. Dr. Moore? Isabella repeated, confused. Well, you're going to medical school, aren't you? Caroline's voice was warm with certainty. You're brilliant, compassionate, and you understand suffering in a way that will make you an extraordinary doctor. The world needs more doctors like you. Isabella looked at Richard, who was smiling with pride. I hadn't really thought about medical school. Think about it now. You have a family who will support you, and I suspect you have an uncle who wouldn't mind paying for your education. Richard nodded emphatically. Anything you want, Isabella. Medical school, nursing doctorate, whatever makes you happy. Right now, what would make me happy is seeing you both together, Isabella said. When can we visit? Agent Chen said tomorrow morning. There's a secure wing here where we can spend time together while the prosecutors prepare their case. After they hung up, Isabella sat quietly for a long time, absorbing the reality of her new life. She had a mother who was alive and recovering. She had an uncle who'd spent 30 years searching for her. She had opportunities she'd never dreamed of, and a future that was suddenly bright with possibilities. Isabella, Richard said gently, I know this is all overwhelming. If you need time to process everything. I need to go back to work, she said suddenly. What? My shift starts in 2 hours. I have patients who are counting on me, and I've already missed 3 days. Isabella stood up, her expression determined. Besides, after everything that's happened, I need to do something normal, something that reminds me who I am. Madison smiled. You're going back to saving lives. It's what I do. It's who I've always been. Family or no family. Isabella paused at the study door. But it's nice to know that now, when I come home from saving lives, I'll have people waiting for me. Richard watched his niece leave, marveling at her strength and resilience. She'd survived abandonment, kidnapping threats, and the complete upheaval of her identity. And her response was to go back to work helping others. Caroline had raised an extraordinary daughter, even from a distance. His phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. Whitaker just gave us the location of 6 more properties. We're executing search warrants as we speak. This keeps getting bigger. Richard showed the message to Madison, who shook her head in amazement. How many lives did that bastard destroy? She asked. We may never know the full extent, Richard replied. But at least now, we can start putting the pieces back together. Outside, the news vans were still broadcasting live updates to a nation transfixed by the story of a family torn apart by greed and reunited by love. Inside the mansion, Richard Calloway sat in his father's study, finally understanding what it meant to come home. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Houston buzzed with the energy of a trial that had captivated the nation. Outside, protesters held signs demanding justice for victims of corruption, while inside, the most comprehensive racketeering case in Texas history was reaching its climax. Caroline Calloway sat in the witness chair, her voice steady and clear as she recounted 30 years of captivity to a courtroom packed with reporters, federal agents, and the families of other victims. She wore a simple blue dress that Isabella had picked out for her, and around her wrist was the ruby bracelet, no longer a symbol of loss, but of survival. Mr. Whitaker told me that if I ever tried to contact my family, if I ever told anyone what I'd witnessed, he would kill my daughter, Caroline testified. I believed him, because I'd seen what he was capable of. I'd seen other girls disappear when they became inconvenient. In the gallery, Richard sat next to Isabella, both of them listening to Caroline's testimony with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Over the past 6 months, Caroline's health had dramatically improved. The kidney transplant, with Isabella as the donor, had been successful, and the reunion with her family had given her a strength that no medication could provide. The prosecution had built their case around Caroline's notebook, the detailed record of Whitaker's crimes that she'd compiled during her captivity, combined with Crow's testimony and decades of financial records. The evidence was overwhelming. Whitaker's defense team had tried every legal maneuver possible, but the facts were insurmountable. Mrs. Calloway, the prosecutor continued, can you tell the court about the last time you saw Mr. Whitaker before your rescue? Caroline's eyes found Whitaker at the defense table. He sat slumped in his chair, looking every one of his 73 years. The man who had once seemed omnipotent now looked like what he truly was, a broken old criminal facing the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty. He came to the facility in Beaumont where I was being held, about a month before Isabella was born. He was angry because someone was asking questions about old construction contracts. And he blamed my family for stirring up trouble. Caroline's voice remained steady. He told me that if the investigation continued, he would make sure my child never saw its first birthday. And what did you do? I started keeping records, names, dates, conversations I overheard, financial transactions I witnessed. I hid everything in a notebook because I knew that someday, somehow, someone would need proof of what he'd done. The prosecutor held up the weathered notebook, its pages now sealed in evidence bags. This notebook, yes, I risked everything to compile that information, because I knew it might be the only way to stop him. During the lunch recess, the Calloway family met in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse. Caroline looked exhausted but determined, while Isabella monitored her mother's vital signs with the protective instincts of both a nurse and a daughter. How are you holding up? Richard asked. Better than I expected. Caroline squeezed Isabella's hand. Having you both here makes all the difference. Madison joined them, fresh from interviewing family members of other victims in the hallway. The jury's paying attention to every word. I think they understand the scope of what Whitaker did. What about the other cases? Isabella asked. Have they found more survivors? Madison's expression grew somber. 3 more women, all held at different facilities over the years. 2 of them are willing to testify. The third, she shook her head. Some wounds are too deep. Agent Chen appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Calloway, they're ready for you. The afternoon session focused on the rescue operation and the evidence that had led to Whitaker's arrest. Caroline described the phone call from Richard, the terror of realizing her family had found her, and the mixed relief and fear when federal agents had secured the Houston medical facility. "I kept waiting for it to be a trick," she testified. 30 years of captivity teaches you not to trust hope. But when I saw Isabella, when I realized my daughter was alive and strong and everything I'd dreamed she could be, I knew it was real." The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and perfunctory. Whitaker's legal team knew they were fighting a losing battle. The best they could hope for was to minimize the sentence, though with federal racketeering charges, kidnapping, and conspiracy convictions likely, their client would die in prison regardless. "No further questions, Your Honor." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the gravity of someone announcing the end of an era. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit racketeering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of kidnapping, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty." The litany continued. 23 separate charges, 23 guilty verdicts with each proclamation. Another piece of the empire that Donald Whitaker had built on the suffering of others crumbled into dust. When it was over, Whitaker was led away in shackles, his shoulders stooped with the weight of his crimes. He didn't look back at the courtroom, didn't acknowledge the families he'd destroyed or the lives he'd stolen. Even in defeat, he remained the same selfish, calculating man who had ordered the kidnapping of a 10-year-old girl to protect his business interests. 3 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Caroline Foundation took place on a crisp autumn morning in Dallas. The organization's headquarters occupied a gleaming new building in the medical district, designed to provide support services for trafficking survivors and fund scholarships for students pursuing careers in healthcare and social services. Caroline stood at the podium, addressing a crowd that included federal officials, hospital administrators, and dozens of survivors whose lives had been touched by Whitaker's network. Her voice was strong, her color healthy, her spirits higher than they'd been since childhood. 30 years ago, a 10-year-old girl was taken from her backyard and thrust into a nightmare that seemed like it would never end, she began. But nightmares do end, and healing is possible, and families can be reunited even after decades of separation. In the front row, Isabella beamed with pride, wearing her hospital scrubs because she had a shift starting in 2 hours. Medical school applications were due next week, and she'd already been accepted to 3 prestigious programs. The future that had once seemed impossible was now filled with unlimited possibilities. Richard sat beside her, no longer the hollow man who had built walls around his grief. The Caroline Foundation was just the beginning. He planned to use his wealth and influence to ensure that no other family would suffer as his had suffered. This foundation exists because of the courage of survivors, the dedication of investigators like Madison Price, and the love of families who never give up hope, Caroline continued. But mostly, it exists because of the belief that every person, no matter how lost they may seem, deserves a chance to come home. After the ceremony, the 3 of them walked to the building's rooftop garden, where they could see the Dallas skyline stretching toward a horizon that seemed endless with possibility. Caroline removed the ruby bracelet from her wrist, holding it up to catch the afternoon sunlight. The stone sparkled like a star, its deep red glow warm and alive. "Isabella," she said, "this bracelet has traveled a long journey. It was a gift of love, then a symbol of loss, then a beacon of hope that led us back to each other." She fastened the bracelet around Isabella's wrist, just as she had dreamed of doing for 25 years. Now it's a seal of return, a promise that love is stronger than fear, that families can heal, and that home is not a place. It's the people who refuse to let you go. Isabella held her mother's hands, feeling the weight of the bracelet on her wrist. Not heavy, but substantial, real, permanent. "Thank you," she whispered. Richard put his arms around both women, his sister and his niece, the family he'd thought was lost forever. "Thank you for finding your way home." The sun set over Dallas, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, the lights of St. Raphael Hospital twinkled like earthbound stars, where tomorrow Isabella would return to her calling of saving lives, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and she belonged. The ruby caught the last rays of sunlight, no longer a reminder of pain, but a celebration of return. And in the space between loss and recovery, between the darkness of the past and the brightness of the future, the Calloway family stood together, whole at last,